The moving truck's engine groaned as it crawled up the dusty dirt road, each turn of the wheels kicking up a cloud of fine desert sand. I sat behind the wheel, my knuckles white from gripping it too tightly. The barren landscape stretched out before me, an endless sea of scrub brush and sun-bleached rocks. "Almost there," I muttered to myself, though the words brought little comfort. Our new home appeared on the horizon, a weathered single-story ranch house that seemed to blend into the desolate surroundings. The realtor had called it rustic charm. Now, seeing it in person, I couldn't help but think abandoned might have been a more fitting description. As I pulled into the gravel driveway, a sense of unease settled over me. The house stood silent, its windows dark and uninviting. The nearest neighbor was miles away, hidden behind rolling hills of sand and cacti. Isolation had never bothered me before, but something about this place felt different. Wrong. I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to nerves and exhaustion from the long drive. This was our fresh start, a chance to leave the past behind and build something new. I couldn't let baseless anxiety ruin it before we'd even unpacked. Stepping out of the truck, the desert heat hit me like a physical force. The air was thick and still, carrying the acrid scent of creosote and sun-baked earth. As I moved to the back of the truck to start unloading, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I turned, scanning the horizon, but saw nothing but shimmering heat waves rising from the ground. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My gaze lingered on a distant cluster of rocks, their shadows seeming to shift and elongate in ways that defied the sun's position. Just a mirage, I told myself, but the words sounded hollow even to my own ears. With a deep breath, I threw myself into the task of unloading, trying to ignore the prickling sensation at the back of my neck. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, I finally finished bringing the last of our belongings inside. Exhausted, I collapsed onto a makeshift bed of blankets in what would become the living room. The house creaked and settled around me, unfamiliar sounds in an unfamiliar place. As I drifted off to sleep, my last conscious thought was a silent prayer that things would feel better in the morning. I had no idea then how wrong I would be. The next few days passed in a blur of unpacking and settling in. I tried to ignore the growing sense of unease that seemed to permeate the house, focusing instead on the practical tasks of making our new home livable. But as the initial busyness faded, I found it harder to dismiss the strange occurrences that began to pile up. It started small. Items would go missing only to turn up in places I was certain I hadn't left them. At first, I blamed it on the chaos of moving, on my own forgetfulness. But as it happened more frequently, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then came the sounds. In the dead of night, when the desert fell silent save for the occasional cry of a coyote, I would hear it. A faint scratching, like nails on wood coming from just outside my bedroom window. Each time I gathered the courage to look, I saw nothing but the empty expanse of our yard, bathed in moonlight. One morning, about a week after we'd moved in, I stepped outside to find strange tracks in the dirt near the house. They were unlike anything I'd seen before, not quite animal, not quite human. The prints were elongated and distorted, as if whatever had made them was walking on the sides of misshapen feet. I stood there staring at the tracks, my mind racing to find a rational explanation. But deep down, I knew that no local wildlife could have left marks like these. As I followed the trail with my eyes, I noticed it led directly to my bedroom window, where the sand was disturbed as if something had stood there for a long time, watching. The realization sent a chill down my spine. I rushed back inside, my heart pounding, and spent the rest of the day obsessively checking and rechecking the locks on every door and window. That night, as I lay in bed trying to convince myself that there was a logical explanation for everything, I heard it again. The scratching. louder this time, more insistent, and beneath it, a low, guttural sound that was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. I wanted to scream, to run, to call for help, but fear had paralyzed me, leaving me frozen in my bed as the sounds continued just outside, separated from me by nothing more than a thin pane of glass. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the noises finally ceased. I lay there, shaking, until the sun was fully up. When I finally found the courage to look outside, I found deep gouges in the wooden frame of my window. Proof that what I'd heard wasn't just a product of my imagination. Something had been there, trying to get in. And somehow, I knew with chilling certainty that it would be back. As the days wore on, the incidents became more frequent and more difficult to ignore. The scratching at my window was a nightly occurrence now, sometimes accompanied by heavy breathing or low, animalistic growls. I took to sleeping in the living room, as far from the windows as possible, but it didn't help. The sounds followed me, as if whatever was out there knew exactly where I was at all times. During the day, I threw myself into researching local wildlife, desperate to find some explanation for what was happening. But nothing I found came close to matching the tracks I'd seen or the sounds I'd heard. The more I searched, the more I realized how little I knew about the area we'd moved to. I began to notice other things too. Small items would go missing from the yard gardening tools, a wind chime, even a small decorative statue. At first, I thought it might be local kids playing pranks, but we were too isolated for that to be likely. And then I found one of the missing items, the wind chime, mangled and twisted almost beyond recognition, half buried in the sand at the edge of our property. The sight of it made my blood run cold. This wasn't the work of animals or mischievous teenagers. Whatever was doing this was intelligent, and it seemed to be sending me a message. One afternoon, as I was hanging laundry on the clothesline in the backyard, I felt the now familiar sensation of being watched. I turned slowly, scanning the horizon, and that's when I saw it. A figure, standing perfectly still among a cluster of cacti about 100 yards away. It was tall, much taller than any person I'd ever seen, and its proportions were wrong. Its arms seemed too long, its legs bent at unnatural angles. I blinked, sure that I must be seeing things, but when I opened my eyes, it was still there. As I watched, frozen in terror, it took a single, fluid step forward. The movement was like nothing I'd ever seen before, smooth yet utterly inhuman. I ran then, abandoning the laundry and fleeing into the house. I slammed the door behind me, engaging every lock, and then collapsed against it, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. For hours I sat there, too afraid to move, too afraid to look out the windows. As night fell, I heard it again, the scratching, the growling, but now accompanied by a new sound. A rhythmic tapping like knuckles on glass, moving from window to window around the house. It was toying with me, letting me know that it could get in any time it wanted. That night, huddled in the bathtub with all the lights on and a kitchen knife clutched in my trembling hands, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here. Whatever this thing was, whatever it wanted, I knew I couldn't face it alone. At first light, I would leave, driving as far and as fast as I could to escape this desert nightmare. But as the sun began to rise, I realized with growing horror that escape might not be as simple as I'd hoped. The driveway, which I could see from the bathroom window, was empty. My car, my only means of escape, was gone. The realization that my car was missing sent me into a panic. I tore through the house, searching frantically for my keys, my phone, anything that might help me call for help or find a way out. But everything was gone. My cell phone, the landline, even the emergency radio I'd bought when we first moved in. As the full weight of my situation sank in, I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. I was trapped here, miles from the nearest neighbor, with no way to call for help. And something was out there, waiting. I spent the day in a frenzy of activity, boarding up windows, barricading doors, and gathering anything that could be used as a weapon. All the while I strained my ears for any sound of approach, jumping at every creak of the house settling or gust of wind outside. As night fell, the scratching began again, more insistent than ever. It moved from window to window, door to door, as if testing my defenses. I huddled in the center of the living room, surrounded by my makeshift weapons, my eyes darting from one boarded-up window to another. Then, suddenly, silence fell. The abrupt cessation of noise was almost more terrifying than the scratching had been. I held my breath, straining to hear anything, when a new sound broke the stillness, a low, rhythmic thumping coming from the roof. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps moving across the ceiling above me. I bit back a scream, my whole body trembling as I tracked the sound of the thing moving overhead. It paused directly above me, and for a moment all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Then, with a deafening crash, a section of the ceiling caved in. Dust and debris rained down, and through the hole I caught a glimpse of something that defied description, a tangle of elongated limbs and dark, leathery skin. I didn't think, I just reacted. Grabbing the nearest weapon, a heavy flashlight, I swung it with all my might at the thing reaching through the hole. There was a sickening crunch of impact, followed by an inhuman shriek of pain and rage. The limb withdrew, and I heard the sound of something large moving rapidly across the roof. Without pausing to think, I raced for the front door, tearing away the barricade I'd constructed. I knew it was dangerous to go outside, but staying in the house was no longer an option. As I burst out into the cool night air, I could hear the thing moving, circling around to the front of the house. I ran blindly into the desert, my lungs burning as I gasped for air, my bare feet bloodied by rocks and cacti spines. Behind me, I heard the sound of pursuit, not the running of an animal, but something else, something that moved in a way that nothing natural should. I didn't dare look back, focusing only on putting as much distance between myself and the house as possible. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing in the sand behind a large boulder. As I lay there struggling to catch my breath, I realized with dawning horror that I had no idea which direction I'd come from. In the darkness, with no landmarks to guide me, I was hopelessly lost. And somewhere out there in the vast empty desert, something was hunting me. I don't know how long I huddled behind that boulder, every muscle in my body tense, straining to hear any sign of pursuit. The desert night was eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the pounding of my heart and my ragged breathing. As the initial surge of adrenaline began to fade, the reality of my situation set in. I was alone in the desert, in the middle of the night, with no supplies, no sense of direction, and no idea how far I'd run from the house. And somewhere out there, something was looking for me. I knew I couldn't stay where I was. With no water and no protection from the elements, remaining stationary would be a death sentence. But moving meant risking detection by whatever was hunting me. In the end, the decision was made for me. A sound cut through the night, a low, guttural call that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was answered by another call, then another, each from a different direction. There was more than one of them. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled to my feet, no longer caring about stealth. I ran, choosing a direction at random, my only thought to put distance between myself and those terrible sounds. The desert landscape was treacherous in the dark. I stumbled over rocks, crashed through scrub brush that tore at my skin, and more than once narrowly avoided falling into dry creek beds that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Behind me I could hear them. The sound of their pursuit was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Not the running of animals, but something else. Something that moved in a way that defied natural law. It was as if they were gliding over the ground, covering impossible distances with each stride. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but still they gained on me. In desperation, I veered towards a cluster of large boulders, hoping to find some place to hide, some defensible position. As I scrambled up the rocks, my hands bleeding from sharp edges and my breath coming in ragged gasps, I heard them approaching. I wedged myself into a narrow crevice between two boulders, making myself as small as possible. For a moment, all was silent. Then I heard it, the sound of something large moving over the rocks, its breathing heavy and rhythmic. It paused near my hiding place, and I could sense its presence just on the other side of the boulder. I held my breath, every muscle in my body rigid with fear. I could hear it sniffing, searching, and I knew that at any moment it might find me. Then, without warning, a piercing shriek split the night. It was answered by more cries coming from all around me. They had me surrounded. As the reality of my situation sank in, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I was trapped, with no hope of escape. Whatever these things were, whatever they wanted, this was the end. But as I prepared myself for the worst, a new sound cut through the night, the distant rumble of an engine. Headlights appeared on the horizon, growing brighter as they approached. The creature's cries turned from triumphant to alarmed. I heard the sound of them retreating, moving away from the approaching vehicle with incredible speed. As the headlights drew nearer, illuminating my hiding place, I felt a surge of hope. Against all odds, someone had found me. But even as relief washed over me, a nagging doubt remained. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night? And more importantly, were they here to help me? Or were they somehow connected to the horrors I'd just escaped? As the vehicle came to a stop nearby, I held my breath, unsure whether to reveal myself or remain hidden. The choice, I realized, might mean the difference between rescue and an even worse fate than the one I'd just narrowly avoided. The sound of car doors opening and closing echoed through the night. Footsteps crunched on the rocky ground, drawing nearer to my hiding place. I pressed myself further into the crevice, torn between the desperate hope for rescue and the fear of revealing myself to potential enemies. "Hello?" a voice called out, tentative and tinged with concern. "Is anyone out here?" It was a woman's voice, and something about its tone, a mixture of fear and determination, resonated with me. Still, I hesitated, my recent experiences having taught me the hard way that nothing in this desert was as it seemed. The footsteps drew closer, and a beam of light swept over the rocks near my hiding spot. "Please," the voice called again. "If you're out here, we want to help. We know about the things. You're not alone." Those last words broke through my paralysis. The thought that someone else knew, that I wasn't crazy or imagining the horrors I'd experienced, was too much to resist. Slowly, cautiously, I emerged from my hiding place. Two figures stood a short distance away, their flashlights trained on me. One was a woman, probably in her early 40s, with a weathered face that spoke of long exposure to the desert sun. The other was a younger man, barely out of his teens by the look of him, with wide eyes that darted nervously around the landscape. "Oh, thank God," the woman breathed, lowering her flashlight slightly. "Are you hurt?" I tried to speak, but my throat was dry and raw from running in fear. I managed a small nod instead. "It's okay," she said, her voice soothing. "We're here to help. Well, let's just call me the librarian. This is the kid. We need to get you out of here before they come back." The mention of they sent a shiver down my spine. "You know about them?" I croaked. The librarian's face hardened. "We do, and we know they'll be back. Come on, we need to move." As we hurried towards their vehicle, an old battered SUV that had seen better days, I couldn't help but ask, "How did you find me?" The kid spoke up for the first time, his voice quiet but intense. We've been monitoring their hunting patterns. When we saw them converge on this area, we knew someone must have escaped. The librarian ushered me into the back seat, then climbed in beside me while the kid took the wheel. As we sped away from the rock formation, I caught a glimpse of movement in the rearview mirror, a tall, misshapen form silhouetted against the starlit sky. I shuddered and sank lower in my seat. "What are they?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The librarian sighed heavily. "We don't know, not really. They started appearing in this area a few years ago. At first it was just sightings, things people dismissed as tricks of the light or overactive imaginations. But then people started going missing." "The authorities?" I asked. The kid let out a bitter laugh. "They don't believe us, or they don't want to believe. Either way, they're no help." "So it's just you two?" The librarian nodded. "We're part of a larger group. We call ourselves the Watchers. We do what we can to monitor their activities, warn people, and sometimes—" She trailed off, glancing at me. "Sometimes we're lucky enough to save someone." As we drove through the night, the librarian and the kid filled me in on what they knew. The creatures, they refused to give them a name, seemed to be nocturnal, retreating to unknown lairs during the day. They were incredibly fast, strong, and seemed to possess an intelligence that made them all the more terrifying. "But why?" I asked. "Why are they doing this?" The librarian shook her head. "We don't know. Hunting, sport, some purpose we can't even begin to understand? All we know is that they're getting bolder, ranging further from their usual territory." As the first light of dawn began to paint the sky, we pulled up to a small, nondescript building on the outskirts of a tiny desert town I'd never heard of. "Welcome to Sanctuary," the kid said, a hint of pride in his voice. "It's not much, but it's safe. They can't come here during the day, and we've got defenses for the night." As I stepped out of the car, exhaustion hit me like a physical force. The events of the night caught up with me all at once, and I swayed on my feet. The librarian caught my arm, steadying me. "Let's get you inside. You need rest. But first—" She paused, her expression serious. "You need to make a choice. We can help you get back to your old life if that's what you want. Or you can stay, join us, help us fight back." I looked at the building before me, then back at the desert we'd just escaped from. I thought about the horrors I'd witnessed, the narrow escape I'd had. And I thought about all the other people out there, unaware of the danger lurking in the shadows. In that moment, I knew there was only one choice I could make. "I'll stay," I said, my voice hoarse but determined. "I can't go back to my old life knowing what's out there. I want to help." The librarian nodded, a mix of approval and sadness in her eyes. "It won't be easy," she warned. "Once you're in this fight, there's no going back." "I understand," I replied, thinking of the horrors I'd witnessed and the narrow escape I'd had. "But I can't just walk away." The kid clapped me on the shoulder, a grim smile on his face. "Welcome to the Watchers," he said. Inside, Sanctuary was a hive of activity despite the early hour. A dozen or so people bustled about, some poring over maps spread across tables, others maintaining what looked like homemade surveillance equipment. They all paused briefly as we entered, eyeing me with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. The librarian led me to a small room off to the side. "Get some rest," she said. "We'll talk more when you've had a chance to recover." I wanted to protest, to start helping immediately, but exhaustion won out. I collapsed onto the narrow cot and was asleep almost instantly. When I woke, sunlight was streaming through a small, high window. For a moment I didn't know where I was. Then the memories came flooding back. The chase, the rescue, my decision to stay and fight. I found clean clothes laid out for me, sturdy, practical garments suited for the desert environment. After changing and splashing some water on my face from a basin in the corner, I made my way back to the main room. The kid was there, hunched over a computer terminal. He looked up as I approached. "Sleep well?" he asked. I nodded. "How long was I out?" "About 12 hours, he replied. "You needed it. The librarian wants to see you when you're ready. She's in the strategy room." I followed his directions to a small, cluttered office. The librarian was there, surrounded by stacks of books, papers, and what looked like plaster casts of strange footprints. She looked up as I entered. "Good, you're up," she said. "How are you feeling?" "Better," I replied. "Still processing everything, but I'm ready to help. What do you need me to do?" She gestured for me to sit. "First, we need to know everything you can tell us about your encounter. Every detail, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant." For the next few hours, I recounted my experience, starting from the day I moved into the desert house. The librarian listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes or asking for clarification. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Your account matches what we've heard from others," she said. "But there are a few details that are new. The way they toyed with you, removing your means of escape, that suggests a level of planning we haven't seen before." "What does it mean?" I asked. She shook her head. "I'm not sure yet, but it's concerning. They're evolving, becoming more strategic." She stood up, pacing the small room. "We need to step up our efforts, and for that, we're going to need your help." "Anything," I said. "Just tell me what to do." The librarian smiled, but it was a grim expression. "We're planning an expedition," she said, "into their territory. We need to find out where they're coming from, maybe even what they are. It's dangerous, possibly suicidal. But it might be our only chance to stop them before more people get hurt." I felt a chill run down my spine at the thought of voluntarily going back into that nightmare. But I also felt a surge of determination. "When do we leave?" I asked. "Tomorrow night," she replied. "We move under cover of darkness just like they do. It's our best chance of getting close without being detected." As I left the strategy room, my mind was reeling. In just a few days, my entire world had been turned upside down, and now I was preparing to journey into the heart of the danger I'd so narrowly escaped. But as I looked around at the dedicated faces of the watchers, I knew I'd made the right choice. Whatever horrors awaited us out there in the desert night, we would face them together. The next day passed in a blur of preparation. The watchers moved with practiced efficiency, gathering supplies, checking equipment, and reviewing plans. I tried to absorb as much information as I could, but the sheer volume of it was overwhelming. As dusk approached, a tense atmosphere settled over Sanctuary. The expedition team gathered in the main room for a final briefing. There were 6 of us: myself, the librarian, the kid, and 3 others I'd come to know as the mechanic, the doctor, and the tracker. The librarian stood before us, her face grave. "We all know the risks," she said. "Once we're out there, we'll be in their territory. We move fast, we move quiet, and above all, we stick together. Any sign of trouble, we abort and head back to the extraction point. Understood?" We all nodded solemnly. As night fell, we piled into 2 rugged off-road vehicles. The mechanic and the doctor took one, while I rode with the librarian, the kid, and the tracker in the other. We set out into the desert, our headlights cutting through the darkness. For hours, we drove in tense silence, following a route that the tracker had mapped out based on previous sightings and encounters. As we ventured deeper into their territory, I felt a growing sense of dread. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rock formation looked like it might be hiding one of those creatures. Finally, we reached our destination, a series of deep canyons that the watchers believed might hide the creature's lair. We parked the vehicles in a hidden ravine and continued on foot. The desert night was eerily quiet as we made our way through the twisting canyons. The only sounds were our muffled footsteps and the occasional whisper of communication between team members. The tracker led the way, consulting a device that looked like a cross between a GPS and a Geiger counter. We had been walking for maybe an hour when the tracker suddenly held up a hand, signaling us to stop. He pointed to something on the canyon wall. As we drew closer, I saw what had caught his attention, a series of deep gouges in the rock face, as if something with incredibly strong claws had climbed up. The librarian examined the marks closely. "They're fresh," she whispered. "We're on the right track." We pressed on, now even more alert. The canyon seemed to be getting deeper, the walls closing in around us, and then, without warning, the narrow passage opened up into a vast cavern. What we saw there stopped us in our tracks. The cavern floor was littered with bones. Some animal, some disturbingly human-like. Strange markings covered the walls, symbols that hurt my eyes to look at directly. And at the far end of the cavern, barely visible in the gloom, was an opening that seemed to lead even deeper underground. The kid's voice broke the stunned silence. "We found it," he breathed. "We actually found their lair." But before anyone could respond, a blood-curdling shriek echoed through the cavern. It was answered by more cries, coming from all around us. "It's a trap!" the librarian yelled. "Run!" We turned to flee, but dark shapes were already pouring into the cavern from the passage we'd entered through. We were surrounded, cut off from our escape route. As the creatures closed in, their misshapen forms becoming clearer in the dim light, I realized with growing horror that this might be the end. We had come seeking answers, but instead, we had walked right into their clutches. In that moment, as the creatures prepared to attack, I couldn't help but think of how far I'd come from my quiet life just a week ago. I had sought a new beginning in the desert, but I never could have imagined it would lead me here, to this nightmarish cavern, face to face with horrors beyond imagination. As the first creature lunged forward, its elongated limbs reaching for us, I knew that whatever happened next would change everything. The real battle was just beginning, and the fate of not just our small group, but perhaps all of humanity, hung in the balance. The desert night echoed with our screams and the inhuman cries of our attackers as the darkness closed in around us. As the creatures closed in, time seemed to slow. The librarian's voice cut through the chaos. "The flares! Use the flares!" In our panic, we'd almost forgotten about our emergency equipment. With shaking hands, I pulled a flare from my pack and struck it. Brilliant red light exploded in the cavern, momentarily blinding me. The effect on the creatures was immediate and shocking. They recoiled, shrieking in pain, their elongated limbs flailing as they tried to shield themselves from the light. The kid and the tracker followed suit, igniting more flares and tossing them in a wide arc around us. "The opening!" the doctor shouted, pointing to the passage we'd entered through. "It's clear!" We didn't need to be told twice. As one, we bolted for the exit, the mechanic pausing only to toss a final flare behind us, creating a barrier of light between us and our pursuers. We ran through the twisting canyons, our lungs burning and legs aching. Behind us, we could hear the creatures recovering, their angry cries echoing off the rock walls, but the flares had given us the head start. As we emerged from the canyon into open desert, I saw the welcome sight of our vehicles, right where we'd left them. We piled in, engines roaring to life as the mechanic and the kid took the wheels. We sped across the desert, all of us tense, expecting at any moment to see those terrifying shapes appear in the rearview mirrors. But as the miles stretched on and the first light of dawn began to paint the sky, we slowly began to relax. We had made it. We had escaped. Back at Sanctuary, exhausted but alive, we gathered to debrief. Despite the terror of our narrow escape, there was a sense of excitement in the air. We had found their lair. We had seen firsthand their weakness to light. For the first time since this nightmare began, we had hope. The librarian spread out a map on the table. "We know where they're coming from now," she said, her voice filled with determination. "And we know how to hurt them. It's time to take the fight to them." Over the next few weeks, we planned and prepared. The mechanic worked tirelessly, developing powerful UV lights that could be mounted on our vehicles. The doctor analyzed samples we'd managed to collect from the cavern, searching for any biological weaknesses we could exploit. The tracker used our newfound knowledge to predict the creature's movements with increasing accuracy. As for me, I threw myself into training, learning everything I could about survival, combat, and our enigmatic enemy. The terror of that night in the cavern never fully left me, but it was overshadowed by a growing sense of purpose. We were no longer just survivors or watchers. We were becoming warriors. Finally, the day came for our counterattack. Our plan was daring, perhaps even reckless, but it was our best chance to end this threat once and for all. We would drive into the heart of their territory in broad daylight, when they were at their weakest, and seal their underground lair with explosives. As we set out, our convoy armed to the teeth with lights and weapons, I thought back to the day I arrived in this desert, seeking a new beginning. I had found one, just not in the way I expected. Whatever happened next, I knew that the lonely, frightened person I had been was gone. In their place stood someone stronger, someone ready to face the darkness and fight for a future free from fear. The desert stretched out before us, no longer a place of terror, but a battlefield where we would make our stand. As we drove towards our destiny, I felt a surge of hope. We had survived the night. Now it was time to bring the dawn. The convoy of vehicles thundered across the desert, kicking up clouds of dust in our wake. The sun beat down mercilessly, but for once, we welcomed its harsh glare. It was our greatest ally in this fight. As we approached the canyon that led to the creature's lair, tension mounted. The librarian's voice crackled over our radios. "Remember the plan. We go in fast, set the charges, and get out. No heroics." We entered the canyon, our modified vehicles bathing the rock walls in intense UV light. If any of the creatures were around, they remained hidden, unable to withstand the artificial daylight we brought with us. When we reached the cavern entrance, we moved with practiced efficiency. The mechanic and the kid began setting up the explosives while the rest of us formed a protective perimeter, our UV spotlights scanning for any sign of movement. Suddenly, the tracker's voice cut through the eerie silence. "Movement! 3 o'clock!" We swung our lights in unison, catching a glimpse of a dark, elongated form retreating deeper into the cavern. More shapes followed, a whole group of the creatures fleeing from the light. "They're retreating further underground," the doctor observed. "This might work better than we hoped." With the charges set, we began our withdrawal. That's when things went sideways. A tremor shook the ground, causing loose rocks to rain down around us. One particularly large boulder crashed down, blocking our exit path. "We're cut off!" the kid shouted, panic evident in his voice. For a moment, despair threatened to overwhelm us. We were trapped, with only minutes before the explosives detonated. But then, something unexpected happened. From deep within the cavern came a sound, not the terrifying shrieks we'd come to associate with the creatures, but something almost plaintive, desperate. And then, emerging from the shadows, came one of the creatures. But instead of attacking, it gestured towards the blocked passage, then back to itself. The librarian was the first to understand. "It wants to help," she said, disbelief coloring her voice. I think it wants to escape too." In that moment, We realized that perhaps these creatures weren't the mindless monsters we'd believed them to be. They were trapped, just as we were, caught in a cycle of fear and violence. Working together, humans and creature alike, we managed to clear the passage just in time. As we raced out of the canyon, the explosion rocked the ground behind us, sealing the underground lair forever. In the aftermath, as the dust settled, we made an astounding discovery. The creature that had helped us was not alone. Others emerged, blinking in the sunlight, no longer hostile but curious and seemingly relieved. The doctor's analysis revealed the truth. These beings were the result of long-forgotten experiments, trapped underground and warped by isolation and fear. With patience and understanding, we found ways to communicate, to coexist. In the months that followed, our little desert community transformed. What had once been a battleground became a place of healing and reconciliation. The creatures, no longer forced to hunt in the night, began to change, their forms slowly returning to something more recognizably human. As for me, I found the new beginning I had sought when I first came to the desert. But it was so much more than I could have ever imagined. I had found purpose, friends who had become family, and a role in bridging two worlds. One evening, as I stood watching the sunset with the librarian, she turned to me with a smile. "You know," she said, "I think it's time we stopped calling ourselves the Watchers. That chapter of our story is over." I nodded, understanding. "So what do we call ourselves now?" She looked out over the desert where humans and former creatures were working together to build a new community. "How about the Unifiers?" As the last light faded from the sky, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The night was no longer something to fear. We had faced the darkness, both within and without, and emerged stronger for it. Whatever challenges the future held, we would face them together, in the light of a new dawn. My name is Everett Klein, and I've lived in Missoula, Montana for most of my life. The story I'm about to tell you happened a few years back, just outside the city limits. It's a tale that's haunted me ever since, one that's changed how I view the wilderness I once thought I knew so well. I've always considered myself an outdoors type. Hunting, fishing, hiking, you name it, I've done it. I even fancy myself a bit of a survivalist. Growing up in Montana, it's almost a requirement. The rugged landscape demands respect and preparation. Little did I know that all my experience would be put to the ultimate test during what should have been a routine camping trip. Before I dive into the events of those terrifying days, let me paint you a picture of the land we're dealing with. Missoula is surrounded by what locals affectionately call Rio Rugged, a nickname for the expansive wilderness that encapsulates everything wild about Montana. We're talking dense forests that stretch as far as the eye can see, mountain ranges that touch the sky, and hidden valleys that have probably never felt a human footprint. It's beautiful, but it's also unforgiving. Now, I've always believed in being prepared. My garage is filled with top-of-the-line camping gear, survival equipment, and enough dried food to last months. I've got first aid kits that would make an EMT jealous, and navigation tools that could get me out of the Amazon. But sometimes, all the preparation in the world isn't enough when nature decides to throw you a curveball. It was late August when my buddy Nolan reached out to me. Nolan and I go way back. We met in college where I was studying environmental science and he was pursuing a business degree. After graduation, our paths diverged. I stayed in Missoula, working as a park ranger and wilderness guide, while Nolan moved to Seattle to climb the corporate ladder. Despite the distance, we kept in touch. Nolan would often call, lamenting about the stress of city life and reminiscing about our college adventures. It was during one of these calls that he proposed the idea of a camping trip. "Ev," he said, his voice tinny through the phone, "I need to get out of this concrete jungle. Remember how we used to talk about that secret fishing spot of yours? Think you could show me?" I hesitated. The spot he was referring to was deep in the backcountry, far from any marked trails. It wasn't a place for beginners. But Nolan was insistent. "Come on, man, I need this. I want the full, untamed wilderness experience. No tourist trails, no glamping. The real deal." Maybe it was the pleading in his voice, or maybe it was my own nostalgia for our college days, but I found myself agreeing. "All right," I said, "but you better be prepared for some serious hiking. This isn't a walk in the park." We spent the next few weeks planning. I sent Nolan a list of essential gear, made sure he was up to date on his vaccinations, and gave him a crash course in wilderness survival over our video calls. He seemed eager, soaking up every bit of information I threw his way. The day before our departure, I double-checked my own gear. Tent, sleeping bags, water purification systems, first aid kit, emergency beacon, bear spray. Everything was accounted for. I also packed my trusty hunting rifle. It wasn't hunting season, but in the deep wilderness, it never hurts to have some extra protection. As I was zipping up my backpack, my wife Laura came into the garage. She's always been supportive of my outdoor adventures, but I could see the worry in her eyes. "You sure about this, Ev?" she asked, leaning against the door frame. "Taking Nolan out there? He's not exactly outdoorsy." I nodded, understanding her concern. "I know, but he needs this. And hey, it'll be good for him to get some dirt under his fingernails for once." Laura smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Just be careful, okay? That area you're going to, it's pretty remote." "Always am," I reassured her, pulling her into a hug. "We'll be back before you know it, with plenty of fish and stories to share." If only I had known then how prophetic her words would be. If only I had listened to that nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20ths. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, a perfect Montana summer day. I picked up Nolan from the airport and we headed straight for the trailhead. As we drove, I couldn't help but notice how out of place he looked. His hiking boots were spotless, his backpack still had the price tag on it, and he was wearing a button-up shirt that looked more suited for a casual Friday at the office than a wilderness trek. "You sure you're ready for this?" I asked as we pulled into the parking lot at the edge of the wilderness area. Nolan grinned, his excitement palpable. "Born ready, Ev. Let's do this." We shouldered our packs and set off. The first few miles were on a marked trail, winding through towering pines and across babbling streams. Nolan kept up a steady stream of chatter, pointing out every bird and flower like a kid on a field trip. It was endearing in a way, seeing the wilderness through fresh eyes. As we hiked, I filled him in on the local flora and fauna, pointing out edible plants and teaching him how to spot animal tracks. He soaked it all in, asking questions and taking notes on his phone. I had to remind him several times to watch where he was stepping instead of staring at his screen. By midday, we reached the point where we'd leave the marked trail behind. I pulled out my GPS, double-checking our coordinates. "All right, Nolan," I said, gesturing to the dense forest ahead of us. "From here on out, we're in true backcountry. Stay close, watch your step, and let me know if you need a break." Nolan nodded, his earlier enthusiasm somewhat dampened by the reality of our situation. The untamed wilderness stretched out before us, a sea of green broken only by the occasional rocky outcropping or fallen tree. As we pushed deeper into the forest, the terrain became more challenging. We climbed over moss-covered logs, skirted around thorny bushes, and navigated steep inclines. Nolan's chatter gradually died down, replaced by heavy breathing and the occasional grunt of exertion. It was during one of our brief rest stops that I first noticed it. A strange odor carried on the breeze. It was faint, barely there, but unmistakable. Like wet dog, but stronger, with an underlying hint of decay. I furrowed my brow, scanning the surrounding forest. Could be a dead animal, I thought, or maybe a bear had passed through recently. "Everything okay?" Nolan asked, noticing my distraction. I forced a smile, not wanting to worry him. "Yeah, just getting my bearings. Ready to move on?" As we continued our trek, the smell came and went. Sometimes it was so faint I thought I might be imagining it. Other times it was strong enough to make my eyes water. But I never saw any sign of its source. No carcass, no bear scat, nothing out of the ordinary. The sun was low on the horizon when we finally reached the clearing by the lake. It was a small body of water, nestled in a natural bowl formed by the surrounding hills. The surface was like glass, reflecting the pink and orange hues of the setting sun. "Wow," Nolan breathed, taking in the view. This is incredible, Ev." I nodded, feeling a sense of pride. This spot had been my secret for years, a place I'd discovered on a solo trip and had kept to myself ever since. Sharing it with Nolan felt right, like passing on a cherished heirloom. We set up camp quickly, working against the fading light. I showed Nolan how to pitch the tent and gather firewood, while I set up our bear bag and prepared our fishing gear. As night fell, we sat around the campfire, roasting hot dogs and sharing stories. It was perfect, almost too perfect. In hindsight, I should have known that in the wilderness, such moments of tranquility are often the calm before the storm. The next morning, we rose with the sun. After a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee, we grabbed our fishing rods and headed to the lake's edge. The water was calm, promising a good day of fishing. I showed Nolan how to cast his line, laughing as he tangled it on his first few attempts. "Don't worry," I reassured him. "It takes practice. You'll get the hang of it." As the morning wore on, we settled into a comfortable rhythm. Cast, wait, reel in, cast, wait, reel in. The repetitive motion was meditative, allowing my mind to wander. That's when I saw it, a flash of movement just beyond the tree line. My hunter's instinct kicked in, and I felt my pulse quicken. It was too big to be a deer, moving too fast to be a bear. Whatever it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me to wonder if I had imagined it. Nolan, oblivious to my sudden alertness, was busy swatting at mosquitoes and cursing under his breath. "How do you stand these bugs?" he grumbled, reaching for the insect repellent for what must have been the 10th time that morning. I was about to reply when I heard it, a branch snapping loud and clear somewhere behind us. The sound echoed across the clearing, unnaturally loud in the suddenly still air. "Ev?" Nolan's voice was hesitant, tinged with fear. "What was that?" I stood slowly, my eyes scanning the tree line. The forest seemed to hold its breath, an oppressive silence falling over the clearing. Then I smelled it again, that wet dog odor, stronger than ever, mixed with something metallic and unpleasant. "Nolan," I said, keeping my voice low and calm, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. We're going to pack up our gear, nice and slow, and then we're going to head back to camp, okay?" He nodded, his face pale. We moved deliberately, trying not to make any sudden movements. As we gathered our things, I kept my eyes on the forest, watching for any sign of movement. We were almost ready to leave when I saw it again, a dark shape moving between the trees. It was big, much bigger than a man, and it moved with an unnatural fluidity that sent chills down my spine. "Run," I whispered to Nolan, my voice barely audible. "Run!" We took off, abandoning our fishing gear in our haste. The sound of our pounding footsteps seemed deafening in the quiet forest, but it was quickly overshadowed by something else, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. As we ran, I caught glimpses of our pursuer through the trees. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. Massive and lean, covered in matted fur, it ran on two legs with a loping gait that ate up the distance between us with terrifying speed. Its face. God, its face. A long muzzle filled with razor-sharp teeth, eyes that gleamed with an intelligence that had no place in an animal. "What the hell is that?" Nolan gasped as we ran, his voice high with terror. "I don't know," I panted back, "but keep running." We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces and roots threatening to trip us at every step. The creature's breathing was a ragged rasp that echoed through the woods, always seeming to be right behind us no matter how fast we ran. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in our flight. But eventually, mercifully, we burst out of the tree line and into a small clearing bisected by a shallow stream. "The water!" I gasped, grabbing Nolan's arm and pulling him towards the stream. "It might mask our scent." We splashed into the cold water, the shock of it barely registering through our adrenaline-fueled haze. We waded upstream for a while before finally collapsing behind a large boulder, our chests heaving as we struggled to catch our breath. Nolan was sobbing quietly, tears cutting clean tracks through the dirt on his face. I felt a surge of guilt. I had brought him out here, promising an adventure. Instead, I had led him into a nightmare. But there was no time for self-recrimination. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of pursuit. For a long moment, all I could hear was the gentle gurgle of the stream and our ragged breathing. Then, faintly, I heard it, that wet dog smell carried on the breeze. "Come on," I whispered, hauling myself to my feet. "We've got to keep moving. It'll pick up our trail again soon." Nolan looked up at me, his eyes wide with a fear I now understood all too well. What was that thing, Ev?" I shook my head, offering him a hand up. "I don't know, buddy, but we can figure it out later. Right now, we need to focus on getting out of here alive." As we set off again, slower this time, but no less urgent, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest, once so familiar and comforting, now seemed alien and hostile. Every shadow held a potential threat, every rustle of leaves a harbinger of doom. Our nightmare was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. As dusk fell, painting the sky in hues of purple and orange, we finally allowed ourselves to stop and rest. We had been moving non-stop since our encounter by the lake, pushing ourselves to the brink of exhaustion in our desperation to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever that thing was. We found a small clearing sheltered on three sides by a rocky outcropping. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. We were both too tired to go any further. "We need to make a fire," I said, my voice hoarse from hours of heavy breathing. "It'll help keep animals away." Nolan nodded wordlessly, his eyes darting nervously around the clearing. He had barely spoken since our flight began, seemingly in shock from the events of the day. We worked quietly, gathering what dry wood we could find. Our supplies were limited. In our panic, we had left most of our gear back at the campsite. All we had were the contents of our day packs, some water, a few energy bars, a basic first aid kit, and thankfully my fire starter. As the flames flickered to life, casting long shadows across the clearing, I finally allowed myself to take stock of our situation. We were lost, with minimal supplies, being hunted by something that defied explanation. The gravity of our predicament hit me like a physical blow. "Ev?" Nolan's quiet voice broke through my thoughts. What do we do now?" I looked at him across the fire. His face was pale, smudged with dirt and scratched from our headlong flight through the underbrush. Fear was etched into every line of his face, but there was also a desperate hope in his eyes, a belief that I would somehow get us out of this mess. I took a deep breath, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. "We rest for now. At first light, we'll try to find our way back to the main trail. Once we're there, we can follow it back to the trailhead." Nolan nodded, seeming to take comfort in having a plan, however tenuous. We fell into an uneasy silence, both lost in our own thoughts as we stared into the flames. As the night deepened, the forest came alive with sounds. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through the trees. Normally these sounds would have been soothing. Now they only served to heighten our anxiety, each noise a potential herald of our pursuer's return. We took turns keeping watch, neither of us able to sleep for more than a few fitful minutes at a time. During one of my watches, as Nolan dozed fitfully by the fire, I heard it, a low guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, my hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife at my belt. The fire had died down to embers, leaving the clearing shrouded in shadows. I strained my eyes, trying to pierce the darkness, but could see nothing beyond the faint glow of our dying fire. The growl came again, closer this time. I nudged Nolan awake, pressing a finger to my lips to keep him quiet. His eyes widened in fear as he heard it too, that inhuman sound that had haunted us since the lake. We sat there, barely breathing, as the minutes ticked by. The growling stopped, replaced by an even more terrifying sound, the snap of twigs and rustle of leaves growing steadily closer. Then I saw it, a pair of eyes, reflecting the faint firelight, peering at us from the edge of the clearing. They were set too high to be a bear or a wolf, and they gleamed with an intelligence that sent shivers down my spine. "Nolan," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "When I say run, you run. Don't look back, don't wait for me, just run." He nodded, his whole body trembling. The creature stepped into the clearing. In the dim light I could make out its massive form, easily 7 feet tall and covered in matted fur. Its face was a nightmare, a long muzzle filled with gleaming teeth, ears laid flat against its skull, those terrifyingly intelligent eyes fixed on us. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing a burning branch from the fire and hurling it at the creature. We took off into the darkness, blind panic driving us forward. Behind us, I heard an enraged roar and the sound of pursuit. Branches whipped at our faces as we ran. Roots threatened to trip us at every step, but we didn't slow down. We couldn't. I don't know how long we ran. Time lost all meaning in the darkness, in the mad scramble to stay ahead of the thing chasing us. But eventually, mercifully, we broke through the tree line and found ourselves on a steep, rocky slope. "Up!" I gasped, pointing to the top of the hill. "It might have trouble climbing." We scrambled up the slope, our hands bloodied on the sharp rocks. Behind us I could hear our pursuer crashing through the underbrush, its growls growing fainter as we climbed higher. At the top of the hill, we collapsed, our chests heaving as we struggled to catch our breath. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten, the first hints of dawn painting the horizon. Did we lose it?" Nolan panted, his voice shaky with exhaustion and fear. I scanned the forest below us but could see no sign of movement. "I think so," I said, not entirely convinced. "But we can't stay here. We need to keep moving." As the sun rose, painting the sky in brilliant shades of pink and gold, we set off again. We were both exhausted, running on nothing but adrenaline and the desperate need to survive. But we pushed on, driven by the fear of what lurked in the forest behind us. The day passed in a blur of exhaustion and fear. We stumbled on, using the sun to keep ourselves oriented roughly eastward, towards where we hoped the main trail would be. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush, sent our hearts racing. But hour after hour passed with no sign of our pursuer. As the day wore on, other problems began to make themselves known. We had no food beyond a few energy bars, and our water was running low. The scratches and bruises from our headlong flight through the forest the night before were beginning to throb and sting. "Ev," Nolan said, his voice weak with exhaustion, "I don't know how much further I can go." I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since our ordeal began. His face was pale and drawn, dark circles under his eyes speaking of sleepless nights and constant fear. His clothes were torn and dirty, and he was favoring his left leg. "We'll rest soon," I promised, though I knew we couldn't afford to stop for long. "Just a little further." It was mid-afternoon when we finally heard it, the sound of running water. Hope surged through me as we pushed through a dense thicket and found ourselves on the banks of a wide, shallow river. "I know where we are," I said, relief flooding through me. "This is the North Fork. If we follow it downstream, it'll lead us back to the main trail." For the first time in days, I saw a glimmer of hope in Nolan's eyes. We stopped long enough to drink our fill and refill our water bottles, then set off along the riverbank. As we walked, I kept a wary eye on the forest around us. The sound of the river would mask any noise of approach, making it the perfect place for an ambush. But hour after hour passed without incident, and I began to hope that maybe, just maybe, we had seen the last of our nightmarish pursuer. The sun was setting when we finally saw it, a wooden sign marking the intersection of the river and the main trail. We had made it. "Oh, thank God," Nolan breathed, sinking to his knees in relief. But I knew we couldn't relax yet. "Come on," I said, helping him to his feet. "The trailhead's only a few miles from here. We can make it before full dark if we hurry." We set off down the trail, our pace quicker now on the even ground. As twilight deepened into night, I pulled out my flashlight, its beam cutting through the growing darkness. We were maybe a mile from the trailhead when I heard it, that familiar wet dog smell carried on the breeze. I stopped dead in my tracks, Nolan bumping into me from behind. "Ev? What's wrong?" I shushed him, straining my ears. For a long moment there was nothing but the normal sounds of the forest at night. Then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl coming from the darkness beyond the reach of our flashlight. "Run," I whispered, pushing Nolan ahead of me. "Run!" We took off down the trail, all pretense of stealth abandoned. Behind us I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush, its growls growing louder as it gained on us. The beam of the flashlight bounced wildly as we ran, barely illuminating the trail ahead. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I pushed on, driven by pure terror. Then suddenly, mercifully, I saw lights ahead, the parking lot. We were almost there. With a final burst of speed, we broke out of the tree line and into the lot. A group of early morning hikers, just getting ready to set out, turned to stare at us in shock. "Call the sheriff," I gasped, collapsing to my knees. "There's something out there." The next few hours passed in a blur. The sheriff arrived, a heavy-set woman named Deputy Hanson, her face a mask of concern as we babbled our story. She listened patiently, then ordered a search of the area. Nothing was found. No tracks, no signs of the creature we described, just the normal flora and fauna of the Montana wilderness. As dawn broke, Deputy Hanson approached us, her face grave. "Boys," she said, her voice low, "I don't know what you saw out there, but I've been working these woods for 20 years, and I've heard stories I can't explain." She fixed us with a stern look. "My advice? Don't go off trail again, you understand? Stick to the marked paths, let someone know where you're going, and for God's sake, be careful out there." It's been 3 years since that nightmarish trip into the backcountry. Nolan hasn't touched a hiking pole since. He moved back to Seattle, threw himself into his work, and does his best to pretend none of it ever happened. As for me, I wish I could write it off as a hallucination, a bad trip brought on by fear and exhaustion. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. That creature, whatever it was real. I still go into the woods. I'm a Montana boy at heart, after all. But I stick to the marked trails now, and I never go alone. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I catch a whiff of that wet dog smell, and my blood runs cold. The wilderness is vast, and we know so little of what truly lurks in its depths. So if you find yourself in the backcountry, remember, the wild isn't always as empty as you think, and sometimes the monsters in the shadows are all too real. It's been years since that fateful hiking trip in Sequoia National Park, but the memories still haunt me. I've spent countless nights trying to make sense of what I saw, what I experienced. Even now, as I sit down to write this account, my hands tremble slightly, and a chill runs down my spine. But I need to share this story, if only to unburden myself of its weight. My name is your name, and I've always considered myself an experienced hiker. I'm the type who craves long expeditions on remote trails, far from the beaten path. The solitude, the challenge, the raw beauty of nature, these are the things that have always called to me. I've faced my share of dangers in the wilderness, encounters with wildlife, treacherous terrain, and even getting lost for brief periods. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in the depths of Sequoia National Park. It was late summer when I set out on what was supposed to be a 10-day backcountry trek. I had meticulously planned the route, obtained the necessary permits, and packed all the gear I'd need for an extended stay in the wilderness. The trail I chose was barely used, winding through the southern part of the park, along steep ridges and into deep, secluded ravines. I craved the isolation, the sense of being truly alone in the vastness of nature. Looking back, I realize how foolish that desire was. The morning of my departure, I felt the familiar thrill of anticipation, the weight of my pack on my shoulders, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots, the scent of pine and earth in the air. It all filled me with a sense of purpose and excitement. As I signed in at the trailhead and took those first steps into the forest, I had no idea that this journey would change my life forever. The initial days of the hike were everything I had hoped for. The weather was perfect, clear skies, mild temperatures, and just enough of a breeze to keep the mosquitoes at bay. The scenery was breathtaking. Massive sequoias towered above me, their reddish-brown trunks stretching impossibly high into the canopy. Shafts of sunlight filtered through the branches, dappling the forest floor with patterns of light and shadow. I made good progress those first few days, covering more ground than I had initially planned. The solitude was profound. Save for the occasional chipmunk or bird, I encountered no other living creatures. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by the sound of my own breathing, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the occasional snap of a twig beneath my feet. At night, I'd make camp in small clearings, always following proper backcountry protocols. I'd secure my food in a bear canister, set up my tent, and enjoy a simple meal while watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Those early evenings were peaceful, filled with a sense of contentment and oneness with nature. But on the fourth night, something changed. I had made camp earlier than usual that day, finding a perfect spot near a small stream. The babbling of the water provided a soothing backdrop as I went about my usual routine. As darkness fell, I built a small fire, more for comfort than necessity. The flames cast flickering shadows on the surrounding trees, creating an almost hypnotic dance of light and dark. It was well past midnight when I first heard it. At first, it was so subtle that I wasn't sure if I had heard anything at all. A rustle in the underbrush, perhaps, or the snap of a branch. In the wilderness, such sounds are commonplace, usually indicating the presence of small nocturnal animals. But this was different. There was a weight to the sound, a deliberateness that sent a shiver down my spine. I sat up in my sleeping bag, straining my ears. For several long moments, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard it again, a heavy footstep, followed by another. Whatever was out there, it was big. My mind immediately went to bears, the most likely large predator in the area. I ran through the mental checklist. Food secured? Check. Fire still burning? Check. Bear spray within reach? Check. But as I listened, a creeping sense of unease began to grow. The footsteps, if that's what they were, didn't sound quite right for a bear. They were too irregular, almost awkward, as if whatever was making them was struggling to move quietly, and they seemed to be circling my campsite, never coming closer, but never moving away. I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak in the vast darkness. "Hello, is someone there?" The sounds immediately ceased. The silence that followed was oppressive, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I waited, heart pounding for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my fear, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning I awoke with the sun, feeling groggy and unsettled. Part of me wanted to dismiss the night's events as nothing more than an overactive imagination fueled by isolation. But as I began to break camp, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Tracks. Large, misshapen tracks in the soft earth around my campsite. I've seen plenty of animal tracks in my years of hiking: deer, bear, mountain lion. But these were like nothing I'd ever encountered. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boot print. The shape was vaguely human-like, but distorted, with elongated toes and what looked like claw marks at the tips. And the gait was all wrong, too wide and uneven for any animal I knew of. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the implications. Someone or something had been watching me during the night. And whatever it wasn't natural. My first instinct was to pack up and head back the way I'd come. Every survival instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there. But a mix of curiosity, stubborn pride, and perhaps a touch of denial made me reconsider. I'd planned this trip for months, and I wasn't about to let some unidentified animal scare me off. Besides, I reasoned, if it had wanted to harm me, it had ample opportunity during the night. So against my better judgment, I decided to continue on my planned route. But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. As I shouldered my pack and set off down the trail, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few minutes, half expecting to see something watching me from the shadows of the forest. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of a nightmare that would push me to the very limits of my sanity and survival. The 5th day of my hike dawned bright and clear, but the beauty of the forest was lost on me. My nerves were frayed from a night of fitful sleep, plagued by vivid nightmares of being chased through endless woods by a shapeless, growling entity. I broke camp early, eager to put some distance between myself and the site of the previous night's unsettling events. As I hiked, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Perhaps it was just a bear with an unusual gait. Maybe the tracks had been distorted by the soft ground. But no matter how I tried to explain it away, a nagging doubt persisted in the back of my mind. The trail became more challenging as the day wore on, winding up steep inclines and along narrow ridges. Under normal circumstances, I would have reveled in the physical exertion and the breathtaking views. But now, every step felt like a struggle. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My pace quickened without me consciously deciding to speed up. I found myself constantly scanning my surroundings, jumping at every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming just days ago, now felt oppressive and threatening. Shadows seemed to move in the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. By mid-afternoon, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I decided to take a break, finding a small clearing with a fallen log that made for a perfect resting spot. As I sat down and took a long drink from my water bottle, I tried to calm my racing thoughts. "You're being ridiculous," I muttered to myself. "There's nothing out here but trees and wildlife. Get a grip." But even as I said the words, I didn't believe them. Something had fundamentally shifted in my perception of the forest around me. The silence, which I had once found peaceful, now seemed pregnant with menace. The trees, majestic and awe-inspiring before, now loomed over me like silent sentinels, hiding untold dangers in their shadows. As I sat there trying to gather my wits, a sound broke the silence. It was faint at first, barely audible over the pounding of my own heart, but it grew clearer, unmistakable. Whispers. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, carried on the breeze that rustled through the leaves. I couldn't make out words, just a sibilant hissing that raised the hair on the back of my neck. I sprang to my feet, spinning around, trying to locate the source of the sound. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking with fear. "Show yourself!" The whispers ceased abruptly, leaving only the echo of my own voice. But the silence that followed was somehow worse. It felt expectant, as if the entire forest was waiting for something to happen. I didn't wait to find out what. Grabbing my pack, I practically ran down the trail, all thoughts of rest forgotten. My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Was I losing my mind? Had the isolation gotten to me so quickly? Or was there really something out there, something that defied explanation? As the day wore on and the light began to fade, my fear only grew. Every shadow seemed to hide a lurking presence. Every natural sound of the forest became sinister in my paranoid state. I knew I should stop and make camp, but the thought of spending another night out in the open was unbearable. So I pushed on, long past the point when I would normally have stopped for the day. My flashlight beam cut a meager path through the growing darkness, and still I walked, driven by a primal fear that I couldn't name or understand. It was well past midnight when exhaustion finally forced me to stop. I found a small hollow between the roots of a massive sequoia and huddled there, too tired and frightened to even set up my tent. As I drifted into an uneasy sleep, one thought kept repeating in my mind: I'm not alone out here, and whatever is with me, it isn't human. I must have dozed off at some point because I awoke with a start, disoriented and groggy. The forest around me was pitch black, my flashlight having died sometime during my fitful sleep. For a moment I couldn't remember where I was or why I felt so terrified. Then it all came rushing back. The tracks, the whispers, the overwhelming sense of being watched. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I became aware of a faint, sickly sweet odor permeating the air. It was unlike anything I'd ever smelled before, a nauseating blend of rotting meat and something musky and animal-like. The stench seemed to grow stronger with each passing second, and with it came a certainty that chilled me to my core. I wasn't alone. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but fear had frozen me in place. I strained my ears, listening for any sound that might betray the presence of whatever was out there. For several agonizing moments, there was nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of my heart. Then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was unlike any animal sound I'd ever heard, too deep and resonant to be a bear or mountain lion. The growl rose in pitch, becoming a keening wail that set my teeth on edge and sent shivers down my spine. And then I saw it. A massive shape detached itself from the darkness between two towering sequoias. At first, my mind refused to process what I was seeing. It was simply too large, too wrong to be real. But as it moved into a patch of moonlight, I could no longer deny the evidence of my own eyes. The creature stood at least 7 feet tall at the shoulder, moving in a hunched, loping gait that was neither fully bipedal nor quadrupedal. Its body was covered in matted dark fur, but in places I could see patches of leathery skin, mottled and diseased-looking. The limbs were grotesquely elongated, ending in massive paws tipped with wickedly curved claws. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. The muzzle was too wide for any known predator, splitting almost to the creature's ears in a permanent fanged grin. And the eyes. God, the eyes. They glowed with an amber light, filled with an intelligence that was terrifyingly alien. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even breathe. The creature tilted its head, regarding me with an almost curious expression. Then, slowly, deliberately, it took a step toward me. That broke the spell. With a strangled cry, I scrambled to my feet and ran. I abandoned my pack, my supplies, everything. My only thought was escape. I crashed through the underbrush, heedless of the branches that whipped at my face and arms. Behind me, I could hear the creature giving chase, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. I ran blindly with no idea of where I was going or what direction I was headed. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but terror gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. Somehow, miraculously, I broke through the tree line and found myself in a small meadow. In the distance, I could see lights, a road, civilization, safety. But I had only made it halfway across the clearing when I heard something that made my blood run cold. A scream. A woman's voice, filled with terror, cut off abruptly. It came from the same woods I had just fled. I froze, torn between self-preservation and the instinct to help. Before I could decide, 3 figures burst from the tree line, a woman and 2 men, all looking as terrified as I felt. They were shouting incoherently, casting frantic glances over their shoulders, and then I saw why. The creature exploded from the forest, moving with impossible speed. Its face was contorted in a snarl, fangs gleaming in the moonlight. It was gaining on the hikers with every bound. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was a sudden burst of courage, or maybe it was the realization that I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try to help. Whatever the reason, I found myself running back toward the tree line, waving my arms and yelling at the top of my lungs. "Hey, over here!" The creature hesitated, its massive head swiveling in my direction. Those terrible amber eyes locked onto mine once again, and for a moment I was certain I had just sealed my own doom. But the distraction had given the other hikers the head start they needed. They disappeared into the woods on the far side of the meadow, their screams fading into the distance. For what felt like an eternity, the creature and I stared at each other across the moonlit clearing. I was certain it would charge, that my foolish act of bravery would be the last thing I ever did. But to my amazement and relief, it turned away. With one last baleful glance in my direction, it loped back into the forest, vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. I stood there, shaking and gasping for breath, unable to believe what had just happened. Part of me wanted to follow the other hikers to make sure they were safe, but a larger part, the part driven by pure survival instinct, knew I had to get out of there immediately. So I ran. I ran until my legs gave out and my lungs felt like they would burst. I ran until the first light of dawn began to paint the sky. And when I finally stumbled out of the woods and onto a paved road, I collapsed, too exhausted and traumatized to go any further. I don't remember much of what happened immediately after I reached the road. I have vague recollections of a park ranger finding me, of being loaded into a vehicle, of trying desperately to explain what I had seen, but it all blurs together in a haze of exhaustion and lingering terror. When I finally came to my senses, I was in a small hospital room. The sterile white walls and the smell of disinfectant were a jarring contrast to the wild terror of the forest. A nurse explained that I had been found on the side of the road, dehydrated and suffering from exhaustion. I had apparently been rambling incoherently about a monster in the woods. As my mind cleared, park rangers came to interview me. I told them everything about the tracks, the whispers, and finally, the creature itself. I described the other hikers I had seen, hoping against hope that they had made it to safety. But as I spoke, I could see the doubt in the rangers' eyes. They exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of concern and skepticism. "Mister, your name," one of the rangers said gently. "We understand you've been through a traumatic experience. But I need you to understand, we've found no evidence of any large predator in the area you described. And there have been no reports of missing hikers," I protested, insisting that what I had seen was real. But the more I talked, the more I realized how insane it all sounded. A 7-foot-tall monster with glowing eyes, whispering forests. I began to doubt my own memories. Had the isolation and fear played tricks on my mind? The rangers assured me they would investigate further, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They likely thought I had gotten lost, panicked, and hallucinated the whole thing. Part of me wanted to believe that too. It would have been easier, safer, to think it had all been a vivid nightmare brought on by exhaustion and dehydration. But I couldn't shake the memory of those amber eyes, the stench of the creature's breath, the sound of its growl. It had been real. I knew it in my bones. The following days were a blur of medical tests, psychological evaluations, and endless questions. My story made its way to the local news, painted as a cautionary tale about the dangers of solo hiking. Some reports suggested I had encountered a bear and my mind had exaggerated the experience. Others hinted at drug use or mental illness. Through it all, I clung to what I knew to be true, even as doubt gnawed at the edges of my certainty. I scoured news reports and online forums, looking for any hint that others had seen something similar. There were whispers, stories of strange sightings in national parks across the country, but nothing concrete. Nothing I could point to and say, "See, I'm not crazy, it's real." Weeks passed, and life slowly began to return to normal. But I was changed. The experience had left an indelible mark on my psyche. I jumped at shadows, flinched at unexpected sounds. The thought of entering a forest filled me with a primal dread I couldn't shake. And always, there was the nagging fear that somewhere out there, in the deep woods of Sequoia National Park, that thing was still roaming, still hunting. Years have passed since that fateful trip, and I've done my best to move on with my life. I left my job in the city, unable to bear the claustrophobia of tall buildings and crowded streets. Now, I live in a small coastal town, as far from the deep forests as I could get. The sound of waves crashing against the shore brings me a peace I thought I'd never find again. But the memories never truly fade. They come to me in dreams, vivid and terrifying. I wake in the night, drenched in sweat, the phantom scent of rotting meat in my nostrils. In these moments, the doubt falls away, and I know with certainty that what I experienced was real. I've tried to research, to find some explanation for what I saw. I've delved into cryptozoology, folklore, even fringe theories about interdimensional beings. Nothing quite fits, but the search gives me purpose. I've connected with others online who claim to have had similar encounters. Some of their stories ring true, resonating with my own experience. Others seem like obvious hoaxes or delusions. I've learned to be cautious, to question everything, including my own memories. There are nights when I sit on my porch, staring out at the ocean, and I wonder about those other hikers. Did they make it out safely? Do they remember what they saw? Or have they convinced themselves it was all a bad dream, a moment of panic in the woods? Sometimes I envy them that possibility of denial. I haven't set foot in a national park since that day. The thought of it sends a chill down my spine. But recently I felt a pull, an inexplicable urge to go back. Not to Sequoia. I don't think I could bear that. But perhaps to another forest, another trail. Part of me thinks it's madness to even consider it. But another part, a part I'm not entirely comfortable with, wonders if I might find answers. What if I could prove it was real? What if I could find evidence that would make people believe me? Or what if I could see it again? The thought both terrifies and exhilarates me. I know it's dangerous. I know I should let sleeping dogs lie, should be grateful that I escaped with my life and my sanity mostly intact. But the experience changed me, marked me in ways I'm still trying to understand. And deep down, I know that until I face this thing, whether it's a real monster or the demons in my own mind, I'll never truly be free. So I find myself planning, preparing. I've been working out, getting back into shape. I've been studying survival techniques, not just the basics I knew before, but advanced skills. And I've been gathering equipment, better than anything I had on that ill-fated trip. I tell myself it's just a precaution, that I probably won't go through with it. But as I write this account, as I relive those terrifying moments in the woods, I feel a sense of resolution settling over me. I need to know. I need to understand. Whatever's out there, be it flesh and blood or something more supernatural, I'll be ready for it this time. And maybe, just maybe, I'll finally find the answers I've been seeking all these years. To anyone reading this, if you venture into the deep woods, into those places where the silence feels alive and the shadows seem to move, be careful, be alert. And if you hear whispers on the wind or catch a glimpse of amber eyes in the darkness, run. Run, and don't look back. Because now you know, there are things in this world far older and darker than we understand. And they're watching, always watching. Logan, Utah sits in a valley that feels like the bottom of a massive bowl, with mountains rising on all sides like ancient guardians. To outsiders, it's just another small college town, but those of us who grew up here know it's something more. The mountains that surround us aren't just scenic backdrops. They're living entities with their own rules, their own dangers, and their own secrets. I've lived here all my life, watched as the town grew from a sleepy agricultural community into a bustling college hub. But no matter how many new buildings spring up, or how many students flood in each semester, the mountains remain unchanged. They loom over us, dark and ancient, holding stories that the new arrivals never hear. Our group had been friends since high school. 5 of us who shared a love for the outdoors that went deeper than the typical weekend warrior enthusiasm. Ryan had grown up on a cattle ranch and could read weather patterns like books. Mike worked summers as a Forest Service technician and knew every trail and hollow in the range. Tom was our resident hunter, with an almost supernatural ability to spot game. Keith was the quiet one, but his father had taught him tracking since he could walk. Then there was me. I'd spent my childhood exploring these mountains with my grandfather, learning the old stories, the dangerous places, the spots where the terrain could turn deadly in an instant. He'd taught me that the mountains demand respect, not the superficial respect of tourists who snap photos and leave trash at campsites, but the deep respect that comes from understanding you're in something else's territory. Temple Fork was our favorite spot, far enough from the maintained campgrounds to keep out the RV crowd, but still accessible if you knew the roads. We'd been camping there for years, watched it change through seasons, knew its moods and its dangers, or at least, we thought we did. The incident happened last October, when the aspens were turning gold and the nights were getting sharp enough to bite. We'd done this trip 100 times before, a quick overnight to escape the town's noise and remember what real darkness feels like. But this time was different. This time, something was waiting for us. Looking back, there were signs we should have noticed. The week before our trip, the local papers had run stories about unusual animal behavior in the area, deer moving in strange patterns, elk herds abandoning their usual grounds. Even the birds seemed different, more watchful, more nervous. Ryan's father, who'd ranched the area for 40 years, mentioned that his cattle were acting skittish, clustering together even in daylight, refusing to graze in certain areas. "Something's got them spooked," he'd said, his weathered face showing concern. "And it ain't the usual predators." We left town around 6 p.m. that Friday, the sun already sliding behind the western peaks. Ryan's truck led the way, with Mike and me following in my Ford, while Tom and Keith brought up the rear. The familiar route up Temple Fork Road started smoothly enough, paved at first, then well-maintained gravel. "Notice anything different?" Mike asked as we passed the last maintained campground. He was studying the empty sites, his forester's instinct picking up details I might have missed. He was right. The maintained areas, usually busy with weekend campers even this late in the season, stood completely empty. No RVs, no tent campers, not even day-use visitors grilling by the picnic tables. "Maybe it's the weather," I suggested, though the evening was clear and mild. Mike shook his head. "Animals are different too. Look at the tree line." I glanced up while navigating a rough patch of road. Normally you'd see deer emerging at this hour, moving down to graze. But the slopes stood empty, the usual wildlife conspicuously absent. The road deteriorated as we pushed deeper into Temple Fork, requiring four-wheel drive and careful navigation around washouts and fallen branches. We'd chosen our usual spot, a natural clearing backed by a steep hillside, surrounded by dense pines. The position offered protection from wind and a good view of any approaching visitors. Ryan was already unloading when we pulled up. "You guys see any other vehicles on the way up?" he called out. We hadn't. Not a single car, truck, or even ATV track in the fresh dirt. "First time I've seen it this empty," Tom said as he and Keith joined us. "Even the horse trailers are gone from the trailhead." Setting up camp was routine after years of practice. We worked with the efficiency of long experience. Tents positioned, gear stowed, fire pit cleared and lined. But something felt off. The usual forest sounds were missing. No squirrels chattering in the canopy, no evening bird song, just the whisper of wind through pine needles. Darkness settled quickly among the trees. Our fire pushed back the shadows, creating a circle of warmth and light that felt increasingly like a barrier between us and the gathering dark. The conversation flowed easily at first. Work stories, plans for hunting season, the usual camping talk. Keith was mid-sentence when he suddenly went quiet, his head tilting slightly. As our resident tracker, his instincts had saved us from surprise encounters with moose and bears before. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. We fell silent, straining to hear whatever had caught his attention. At first, nothing. Then, a snap of a branch, too deliberate to be random, too careful to be natural wildlife. "Up the hill," Ryan murmured, gesturing with his chin. "Maybe 100 feet. Another sound followed, the subtle crunch of pine needles under weight, moving with measured precision. Whatever was up there was trying to be quiet, and doing a good job of it. "Mountain lion," Tom suggested, but his tone said he didn't believe it. I'd encountered mountain lions before. They moved like smoke, silent and fluid. This was different, calculated, almost methodical in its approach. The fire popped, sending sparks into the night air. In that brief flare of extra light, I caught movement at the edge of our visibility. Something shifted in the darkness, something tall enough to be visible behind the understory brush. We'd brought weapons, we always did. Hunting rifles, personal sidearms, the tools of responsible outdoorsmen. But at that moment, watching the shadows move with unnatural purpose, those weapons felt inadequate. The thing on the hill stopped when we stopped talking, started moving when we resumed. It was learning our patterns, testing our awareness. No animal behaves that way. No human could navigate that terrain in complete darkness with such precision. The next few minutes stretched like hours. We maintained casual conversation, but our attention was fixed on the presence above us. It had established a pattern now, moving closer when we talked, freezing when we fell silent, testing, learning, hunting. Tom reached slowly into his truck cab, drawing out his high-powered flashlight. the kind Forest Service uses for night operations. With deliberate casualness, he set it on his lap, angled toward the hillside. "Now," Keith whispered suddenly. Tom hit the switch. 600 lumens of LED brightness shot into the darkness. For a split second, less than a heartbeat, we saw it. The shape was wrong. That's what my mind registered first. Tall, yes, but the proportions weren't human. The posture wasn't quite animal either. Then it moved, faster than anything that size should be able to move, and vanished into the deeper shadows. "What the hell was that?" Mike's voice came out steady, but I could hear the edge in it. Before anyone could answer, we heard it moving again. No longer trying to be stealthy, it circled our position with impossible speed. The sound of its movement suggested size, branches breaking under significant weight, heavy impacts as it navigated the terrain. I reached for my shotgun, the familiar weight providing little comfort against what we'd glimpsed. The thing circled our camp again, its movement patterns becoming more erratic, more aggressive. "Everyone to the trucks," Ryan commanded, his rancher's voice cutting through our paralysis. "Now!" The fire suddenly seemed feeble, the darkness beyond it alive with movement. As we backed toward the vehicles, the thing made its first direct aggressive move. A massive shadow detached itself from the tree line, charging not at us but at Tom's truck. The impact shook the vehicle, rocking it on its suspension. In the chaos, our flashlight beams caught glimpses: matted fur, impossible height, eyes reflecting red in the artificial light. The shotgun blast split the night. I'd fired more instinctively than intentionally, but the effect was immediate. The creature recoiled, not from injury. The target load wouldn't have done serious damage at that range, but from the sound and muzzle flash. Its reaction gave us crucial seconds. We piled into the vehicles, engines roaring to life. As my headlights swept the area, they caught one final clear image of our stalker, and understanding hit like a physical blow. It was a bear, but not like any I'd seen in these mountains. This was something else, something that shouldn't have been there. A grizzly far south of its usual range, but wrong somehow. Diseased maybe, or deformed. Its behavior, its size, its obvious intelligence, all wrong for a normal bear. The drive down was a nightmare of narrow trails and sharp turns, made worse by the knowledge that something was pursuing us. We could hear it paralleling our descent, crashing through the forest with terrible purpose. Only when we hit the maintained road did the sounds of pursuit fade. We drove straight to the Forest Service station, where Mike called in what we'd seen. They took our report seriously. Too seriously, I thought at the time. The investigation that followed revealed an uncomfortable truth. We weren't the first to encounter this creature. Forest Service had been tracking reports of an unusually large grizzly that had migrated south from Idaho. But this wasn't a normal bear. It was suffering from a combination of factors that had made it both more aggressive and more intelligent in its hunting patterns. They found our campsite the next day. The area showed signs of a massive predator's presence. Prints larger than normal bear tracks, broken branches 10 feet up trees, territorial markings that suggested something far bigger than the local black bears. 2 weeks later, a joint operation between Forest Service and Wildlife Management tracked and eliminated the threat. The creature they brought down confirmed our experience, a grizzly of exceptional size, showing signs of both physical and neurological abnormalities that explained its unusual behavior. Temple Fork has returned to normal now. The regular wildlife has moved back in, and weekend campers have reclaimed the maintained sites. But those of us who were there that night don't camp in the deep woods anymore. The mountains remind us that nature isn't predictable. Sometimes it produces anomalies, creatures that break the normal patterns, that blur the line between natural and extraordinary. Our experience wasn't supernatural, but it showed us that reality can be strange enough without invoking the impossible. The incident changed us in subtle ways. We're more cautious now, more aware of the signs animals leave when they're avoiding an area. We pay attention when the forest goes quiet. Most importantly, we remember that we're not the apex predators we sometimes pretend to be. Logan's Mountains keep their secrets well. Somewhere in those dark forests, there might be more creatures that defy our expectations, more anomalies that challenge our understanding of what's possible. But one thing is certain. When the forest goes quiet and you feel eyes watching from the darkness, it's time to leave. Some say the grizzly they killed wasn't the one we encountered, that our description didn't quite match the animal they brought down. But I prefer not to dwell on that possibility. Some questions are better left in the darkness where they My name is David Johnson. What I'm about to tell you happened on July 23, 2012, a date seared into my memory like a brand, a nightmare from which I've never truly awakened. Before that day, life was simpler. I wasn't some government-sanctioned monster hunter, just a park ranger in the sprawling Evergreen Heights National Park, nestled in the heart of Montana's rugged wilderness. It was good, honest work. I spent my days maintaining trails, educating visitors about wildlife safety, and occasionally rescuing the odd, unprepared hiker. The majestic beauty of the forest was my office, the crisp mountain air my constant companion. I never imagined that the very land I'd sworn to protect would become the stage for a horror beyond comprehension. The morning of July 23rd dawned crisp and clear, the kind of summer day that makes you grateful to be alive. I was sipping my first cup of coffee in the ranger station when the call came in. A hiker had gone missing on the remote Shadowfall Trail, deep in the most isolated part of the park. Not just any hiker, mind you, but Marcus Harding, a seasoned outdoorsman known for his survival skills and intimate knowledge of the area. We assembled a small search team, myself, veteran ranger Tom Cooper, and Elena Rodriguez, a rookie on her first big assignment. Tom was a grizzled old-timer, his leathery face a roadmap of decades spent in the wilderness. Elena was all wide-eyed enthusiasm, her ranger uniform still crisp and new. "Routine stuff," Tom grunted as we loaded up our gear. "Probably just wandered off the trail, got himself turned around." I nodded, but something gnawed at the back of my mind. There had been whispers lately, strange stories from the locals, unnatural sounds echoing through the valleys at night. Livestock found mutilated on ranches bordering the park, their bodies arranged in bizarre patterns. We dismissed it as tall tales, the fevered imaginings of isolated mountain folk. Now I wasn't so sure. The Shadowfall Trail was aptly named. It wound through dense primeval forest, where the canopy was so thick that daylight struggled to penetrate. Moss-covered boulders loomed like sleeping giants, and gnarled roots seemed to reach for your ankles with every step. As we pressed deeper into the wilderness, an unsettling quiet descended. The usual chorus of birdsong and chattering squirrels was absent, replaced by an oppressive silence. Hours passed with no sign of Marcus. No discarded equipment, no trail markings, nothing to indicate he'd ever been there at all. Tom's hand kept drifting to his holstered sidearm, his eyes scanning the undergrowth. Elena's earlier excitement had faded, replaced by a palpable unease. "Maybe we should turn back," she suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. "Call in more resources. Start fresh in the morning." I was about to agree when Tom held up his hand, freezing us in place. "You smell that?" he asked, his nostrils flaring. At first I caught nothing but the usual forest scents, pine resin, damp earth, decaying leaves. But then it hit me. A coppery tang, sharp and sour, completely out of place in these woods. My stomach clenched as we followed the odor off the main trail. We found Marcus Harding's body half hidden beneath the gnarled roots of a fallen sequoia. For a moment, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. This wasn't the ravaged remains of a bear attack or the bloated corpse of an accidental fall. No, this was something else entirely. Marcus had been dismembered with surgical precision. Each limb separated cleanly, no ragged flesh or splintered bone. His torso was splayed open, organs removed and arranged in a bizarrely purposeful pattern around the body. Most disturbing of all was his face, eyes wide open, frozen in an expression of utter terror. "Sweet Jesus," Tom muttered, his gruff demeanor cracking. "This ain't natural. This ain't natural at all." Elena turned away, retching into the underbrush. I stood rooted to the spot, my mind reeling. In all my years as a ranger, I'd never seen anything like this. Suddenly, the vastness of the wilderness pressed in on me. I felt small, vulnerable, like a mouse that's just realized it's wandered into a snake's lair. A twig snapped behind us. We whirled around, weapons drawn. But it wasn't a mountain lion or an angry moose that emerged from the shadows. It was a man, or something that looked like a man. He stood well over 6 feet tall, his muscular frame wrapped in tattered camouflage gear that seemed to blend seamlessly with the forest. A wild, matted beard obscured most of his face, and a battered bush hat cast his features in deep shadow. But his eyes, God help me, I'll never forget those eyes. They glowed with an unnatural, vibrant yellow light. Not the reflected gleam of an animal's eyes in the dark, but an internal radiance that spoke of something utterly inhuman. "What in God's name happened here?" Tom demanded, his voice trembling slightly despite his best efforts. The figure didn't respond. It simply tilted its head, regarding us with an eerie stillness. I had the nauseating sense that we were being studied, evaluated like insects under a microscope. My survival instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the forest floor. Elena whimpered, a small broken sound that seemed to snap the tension like an overstretched rubber band. The thing moved. It wasn't quite a run, more like a blurring lunge that defied the laws of physics. Tom managed to squeeze off a shot, the crack of his pistol shattering the unnatural silence. But the bullet seemed to pass right through the camouflaged figure as if it were made of smoke. In the space of a heartbeat, it was upon Tom. What happened next I can scarcely bring myself to describe. The creature moved with inhuman speed and brutal efficiency. There was a sickening crunch of bone, a spray of crimson, and a scream that was abruptly, horribly silenced. Elena and I ran. We tore through the forest, blind panic driving us forward. Branches whipped at our faces. Roots threatened to trip us with every stride. But we didn't dare slow down. Only when my lungs felt ready to burst did we pause, ducking behind a massive fallen tree. For endless, agonizing minutes we crouched there, hardly daring to breathe. The forest had gone deathly quiet again. No sign of pursuit, no sound of footsteps. Just that oppressive, unnatural silence. "We have to keep moving," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Back to base camp. We need to call for help." Elena nodded mutely, her face ashen. We set off at a more measured pace, constantly scanning our surroundings for any hint of movement. The journey back seemed to take an eternity, every shadow concealing potential horrors. When we finally stumbled into base camp, our story spilled out in a frantic, disjointed mess. The other rangers stared at us in disbelief. Some assumed it was shock-induced hysteria. Others theorized about a rogue bear or mountain lion. But I knew what I had seen, and the haunted look in Elena's eyes confirmed it wasn't just my imagination. They sent in a specialized search team, heavily armed and equipped with the latest tracking technology. They scoured the area for days, but found no trace of Tom's body, no sign of the creature we'd encountered. The official report chalked it up to a tragic wilderness accident, likely an animal attack. Case closed. But I know the truth. I know what lurks in the dark heart of those forests. In the years since that day, I've done my research. I've connected with others who've had similar encounters, compared notes, and pieced together a chilling picture. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't an isolated incident. There are reports stretching back decades, centuries even, of similar creatures stalking the wild places of the world. Some theorize they're some kind of evolutionary offshoot, a branch of humanity that developed in isolation. Others whisper about government experiments gone wrong or extraterrestrial visitors. Me? I don't pretend to know what they are or where they come from. I just know they're out there, watching, waiting. I retired from the Ranger Service not long after the incident. Couldn't bear to go back into those woods, knowing what I know now. Even all these years later, I avoid remote forests and isolated trails. Sometimes, when the night is especially dark and quiet, I swear I can hear unnatural movement just beyond my peripheral vision, a flicker of those inhuman yellow eyes in the shadows. To those who still venture into the deep wilderness, I offer this warning: be careful out there. The greatest predators aren't always the ones with claws and fangs. Sometimes they wear a mockery of human form and hunt with terrifying intelligence. And if you ever find yourself alone in the forest, feeling that prickling sensation of being watched, run and pray it isn't already too late. It isn't.